In the remote, windswept countryside of Ireland, where limestone hills rise like ancient bones from the earth and glacial lakes reflect skies that haven't changed for millennia, a team of archaeologists stumbled upon something deeply unsettling. They had come in search of history, stone walls, medieval ruins, fragments of a bishop's palace, but what they found was something far older and far more disturbing. Buried beneath layers of heavy rock and forgotten soil lay the remains of hundreds of individuals, an entire lost population interred in silence. Most of the skeletons appeared ordinary, the quiet remnants of lives long past, but among them were 3 bodies that stopped the entire excavation in its tracks. One had been twisted grotesquely, its body contorted in a position no natural death could explain. The other 2 had large stones forced deep into their mouths, shattering teeth in the process, as if someone had tried to seal them shut. From the inside, who were these people, and what terrified the living so deeply that they mutilated the dead? In today's video, we're pulling back the veil on one of medieval Europe's darkest fears, the fear that the dead could return. So fasten your seat belt as we dive into today's mystery. But first, you might just receive extraordinary luck if you like and subscribe before this video ends. Nestled in the ancient landscape of Western Ireland lies a place most maps barely mention, Kilteasheen. To locals, it's a land steeped in stories, whispers of fairies that led travelers astray, of glowing lights drifting over the hills, and of spirits that never found rest. For centuries, these tales were passed down by firelight, folded into the very soil of the region. In 2004, a group of archaeologists arrived here with a more grounded mission. They were searching for the remains of a medieval bishop's palace, perhaps some broken masonry, a few religious relics, or a stretch of crumbled defensive walls. What they found instead defied not only their expectations, but scientific explanation. As they began lifting the heavy flagstones of what appeared to be an old structure, they noticed something strange. Human skulls crushed beneath the very foundation of the building. It was as if the structure had been deliberately built on top of the dead. Within a narrow trench, just 3 meters across, they uncovered between 30 and 40 skeletons, stacked chaotically, jumbled together with no clear order or ceremonial placement. This wasn't a burial ground, it was something else entirely, something older, stranger. When the team extended their dig into the surrounding fields, the scale of the mystery grew. More graves appeared, more bones. In time, the archaeologists realized they weren't just dealing with a few dozen remains. They were standing atop a massive burial site, possibly holding the bodies of up to 3,000 people. But then came something even more disturbing. Amid the thousands of skeletons, a handful stood out, and not just because of age or condition. One skeleton had been brutally bent, its spine shattered, its body folded as if someone had tried to break it in half. 2 others had large, jagged stones lodged in their mouths, not gently placed, but rammed in with violent force. These were not the actions of natural decay, nor were they ritual burials meant to honor the dead. They were acts of restraint, acts of fear. Someone at some point believed these people were dangerous, even after death, and that belief would lead the team deeper into a mystery older than Christianity, more persistent than folklore, and still echoing in the way we think about death itself. At first glance, these unusual skeletons might have seemed like isolated anomalies, perhaps the result of random trauma or a misunderstood burial custom. But as the forensic team examined the remains more closely, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. One of the most unsettling finds was that of a male skeleton, estimated to be in his 30s. His body had not been gently laid to rest. Instead, it had been forcibly folded, his legs twisted upward toward his torso in a grotesque and unnatural posture. His spine was broken, his pelvis crushed, and a massive stone had been placed directly on top of his body, as if to pin him to the earth, to stop him from moving, even in death. According to Professor Mark Horton, a leading archaeologist on the team, this was unlike anything he had seen in decades of excavation. This body was shattered, then tied together like a bundle of flesh and bone, he said. It's possible they did this to make absolutely sure this man could never come back from the dead. But what came next chilled the team to their core. The second skeleton, a different male, was found with a heavy, oval stone wedged deep into his mouth. His teeth had been cracked and broken outward, not from time or pressure, but from sheer force. This was not an accident. The stone hadn't simply rolled into place. It had been shoved in with violent, intentional strength. This practice of mouth stoning is almost unknown in traditional Christian burial customs. And yet, here it was, performed not once, but multiple times. As the skeletons were brought back to the lab for analysis, the mystery deepened further. Cleaning away the soil from their bones revealed something even more shocking: long, deep cuts across the legs and ribs of several individuals. The marks were clean and deliberate, consistent with weapons like swords or spears. But these weren't battle wounds. They were post-mortem mutilations, injuries inflicted after death. Why would anyone go to such lengths to harm the dead? One theory began to take shape. These individuals weren't simply outcasts or criminals. They were seen as threats even after they died. The way they were buried, crushed, pierced, restrained, suggested something more than social rejection. It suggested fear. A fear that the dead might not stay dead. And it wasn't just an Irish phenomenon. As news of the Kilteasheen findings spread, archaeologists across Europe began comparing notes. Similar burials had been uncovered in the Czech Republic, in England, in Romania. Some corpses had stakes driven through their hearts. Others were nailed into coffins, their heads removed and placed between their feet, or their bodies buried face down. A symbolic gesture meant to confuse the spirit and keep it trapped underground. They called them deviant burials, graves that deviated from the accepted norms of Christian ritual, where the dead were normally buried straight, with arms crossed, facing west, awaiting the resurrection. But these burials had no such peace. Instead, they whispered of communities that were terrified of what their dead might do if they came back, and that fear, it seemed, had seeped into ritual, into culture, into law. Because the deeper archaeologists dug both into the ground and into the archives, they realized this was not myth, it was memory, and it was written down. If these brutal burials were simply local superstition, the story might end there. But the truth is far stranger, because not only were these fears widespread across Europe, they were written down in detail by monks, priests, and chroniclers. Not as myth, but as historical fact. Take, for example, the chilling case of Stapenhill, a quiet English village in the year 1085. According to records from the nearby Burton Abbey, 2 local farmers had moved into a new settlement. One evening, during a seemingly ordinary dinner, both men suddenly dropped dead. No cause, no illness, no explanation. Their bodies were buried according to proper Christian rites. The community mourned. Life, as always, tried to move on, but within days, the dead returned. Villagers reported seeing strange shadows at night moving across the fields. Sometimes the forms looked human, dragging what appeared to be coffins on their backs. Other times, they shifted into grotesque animal shapes, slithering through the fog. And then came the whispers. According to the chroniclers, anyone whose name was spoken aloud by these figures, these revenants, would soon fall ill and die. Fear swept through the village like wildfire. Entire families fled. Fields were left to rot. What had once been a peaceful hamlet was now seen as cursed, a place where the boundary between life and death had fractured. But what happened next was perhaps most shocking of all. This wasn't handled by angry mobs or frightened villagers. It was handled by the church. In an official decree, religious authorities ordered the graves to be opened. The 2 corpses were exhumed, then decapitated, disemboweled, and their hearts removed and burned. This was not a burial. It was an execution carried out after death, and it wasn't an isolated case. Across medieval Europe, similar events were documented in monastic manuscripts and legal records. In some cases, wandering monks were summoned to perform rites of cleansing. In others, entire villages gathered to destroy the body of a suspected revenant, not out of cruelty, but out of desperation. And the strange part is it worked. After such rituals, the hauntings usually stopped. The fear subsided. Life continued, but something even more unsettling began to crystallize. These weren't isolated events. They weren't rare. They were common enough that laws were written to address them. As medieval Europe tried to organize itself under the structure of the church and the rule of law, something remarkable began to happen. The belief in the restless dead, in corpses that returned to haunt the living, was no longer just a village concern. It had grown so common, so persistent, that laws were written to suppress it. In Ireland, buried deep within a 7th or 8th century religious legal code known as the First Cane of St. Patrick, there lies a striking passage. It doesn't describe ghosts or hauntings with flowery language. It condemns outright those who believe that the dead can return. And why would a religious legal text, a document meant to guide behavior and punish sin, go out of its way to denounce a superstition? Because by that time, belief in revenants had spread so widely, so forcefully, that the church saw it as a direct threat to Christian doctrine. If people feared that the dead could return to harm them, what would that say about the promise of resurrection? About divine peace, about salvation? To the church, these fears were dangerous. To the people, they were reality. And while the clergy debated theology, science, centuries later, would try to bring clarity. In the modern era, forensic specialists have offered practical explanations for many of the phenomena once seen as signs of the undead. They point out that gases from decomposition can cause the chest and abdomen to swell, creating the illusion of movement. That fluids escaping the mouth may resemble blood, giving rise to legends of vampires feeding. That skin can retract, making hair and fingernails appear to grow after death. But in the 8th century, no one knew this. To a grieving family or a terrified village, these signs weren't misunderstood biology. They were warnings. And so, the mutilation of corpses, placing stones in the mouth, folding the limbs unnaturally, breaking the spine, or driving stakes through the chest became ritual acts of protection. These weren't crimes, they were defenses. And the pattern wasn't limited to Ireland. From the decapitated skeletons buried in Czech graveyards, to bodies in English tombs placed face down, to the now famous iron stakes driven through chests in parts of Eastern Europe, archaeologists have unearthed a silent war, fought not on battlefields, but in burial grounds. Each deviant burial tells the same unspoken story. Someone feared what lay beneath would try to rise, and even as religious authorities tried to stamp out that fear with scripture. Even as scientists centuries later tried to explain it away with chemistry and decay. One truth refused to stay buried. For the people who performed these acts, it wasn't superstition, it was survival. If you thought these rituals belonged solely to the dark corners of medieval history, think again. Because in 2004, in the quiet village of Martinu de Sus, Romania, one of the most infamous vampire rituals of the modern age took place, not in secret, but in full view of a community that believed they were doing the right thing. It began 6 weeks after the funeral of a man named Petr Toma, a local who had passed away and been buried according to standard Orthodox Christian rites. At first, nothing seemed unusual. But then his granddaughter began to speak. She told her family that her grandfather was appearing to her at night, silently standing outside her window, hollow-eyed, pale, and unmoving. In her dreams, he never spoke, he just watched. To many in the village, these stories didn't sound strange. They sounded familiar. because in Romanian folklore, there is a word for this kind of encounter, more. A more is not a ghost. It is not a demon. It is the dead returned in unrest, feeding not on blood, but on fear, and slowly draining the life from the living through illness, nightmares, and despair. And so, one night in March, 6 men gathered quietly, carrying shovels. They walked through the dark toward the cemetery. They dug up the grave of Peter Toma, and then, without hesitation, they opened the coffin, pierced his chest, removed his heart, and burned it to ash. The ashes were then mixed into water and given to the granddaughter to drink, a ritual meant not just to banish the more, but to heal the one he haunted. When news of the event spread across Romania, the cities erupted in disbelief. Television anchors called it barbaric. Politicians demanded legal consequences. The ritual made headlines around the world, a vampire exorcism in modern Europe, but in the village where it happened, there was no shame. No one apologized. In fact, the locals believed they had done something kind for the man who had died and for the girl he loved. Because to them, the ritual wasn't an act of violence, it was a release. An act of mercy performed in the name of peace, not fear. And that's what makes this story even more haunting, because it reveals a deeper truth, one that spans time, geography, and belief. That the line between folklore and reality isn't as firm as we think, that the rituals of the past may still live on, not as superstition, but as cultural memory, and that even in the age of science and reason, there are still places in the world where people look at a grave and do not see closure. They see a question, one they cannot afford to leave unanswered. Back in Ireland, the bones recovered from the Kilteasheen excavation were taken to a lab, not just for preservation, but for answers. Scientists hoped that modern tools could reveal what ancient fear could not. Using radiocarbon isotope analysis, they determined the age of the most disturbing remains, the ones with crushed bones and stones jammed deep into their mouths. After 2 weeks of meticulous testing, the results arrived. The burials dated back to somewhere between 720 and 760 AD. That's nearly 300 years before the first written accounts of revenants in England. And almost 1,000 years before vampire folklore would explode across Eastern Europe. Which means one thing: these strange, violent burials didn't emerge in response to books or legends. They came from something older, a fear so primal it was passed not in writing, but in ritual. And perhaps the most chilling confirmation of that fear comes from an ancient Irish legal text, the First Cain of St. Patrick, written in roughly the same period as the Kilteasheen burials. It contains a single, pointed law: to condemn those who believe the dead can return. Think about that. The belief in undead entities, in spirits or bodies that could cross the boundary of death, was so widespread, so disruptive, that religious authorities had to legislate against it. But laws can't erase belief. They can only try to contain it. And so we return to the question no CT scan or chemical test can truly answer. Why did these people fear their dead so deeply that they shattered their bones, sealed their mouths with stone, and buried them under slabs meant to trap them for eternity? Maybe they'd witnessed something. Maybe they simply felt something, a presence, a pressure, a sense that death was not always the end. And if you listen closely, that fear still whispers today. It whispers in Romanian villages where hearts are still burned. It echoes in English legends of men who returned with coffins on their backs. And it lingers in the silence of Irish fields, where the mouths of the dead remain filled with stone, and the ground still refuses to rest. Maybe these stories were never meant to scare us. Maybe they were left behind to remind us that for all our science, our laws, our certainty, there are places beneath the earth where logic does not go, only memory, only ritual, only fear.